when the pause began on September 12th, and then Jews had a chance to kind of ask themselves, what the hell happened? Why didn't we fight back? Why did we let them take our wives and children? Why were we so paralyzed? When the next time they come to get us, we're not going to go so easily.
Last week, Michael Smuss died at age 99. Born in 1926, he was the last surviving fighter of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. His passing marks the end of an era and brings to a close a chapter of living memory. Now the responsibility to tell this story passes fully to us. In the spring of 1943, against impossible odds and with almost no weapons, a small group of young Jews in Nazi-occupied Warsaw staged a revolt that would reverberate through history. Today, we explore the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising with Professor Samuel Kassow, not just as a military engagement, but as a story about Jewish resistance, dignity, and moral decision under unimaginable circumstances. Welcome to the Tikvah Podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Silver. To understand the uprising, we need to understand what came before. Before the war, Warsaw was home to nearly 400,000 Jews, the largest Jewish community in Europe. This was a vibrant, diverse Jewish population, workers and intellectuals, religious and secular, Yiddish-speaking and Polish-speaking. Jews published daily newspapers, ran theaters, fielded soccer teams. They were 40% of Warsaw's population. Then came September 1939. Within weeks, Warsaw fell to the Germans. Over the next year, the Nazis systematically stripped Jews of their rights. Armbands, blocked bank accounts, forced labor. In November 1940, they sealed 400,000 Jews into a ghetto of just 2 square miles, then forced in 150,000 more Jews from nearby towns and cities. With official rations of just 184 calories a day and no heating, 100,000 Jews died of starvation and disease. But 80% stayed alive through extraordinary resourcefulness, smuggling food, establishing soup kitchens, creating underground factories. This, too, was a form of resistance. In July 1942, the Germans began mass deportations to Treblinka, where most were murdered upon arrival. Over 7 weeks, they sent 300,000 Jews to the gas chambers using Jewish police to round up their own people. By September, only 60,000 remained. Then something shifted. Survivors asked why they hadn't fought back. The shame and anger became a catalyst. Between September and April, the ghetto prepared. They built 750 bunkers with electricity, water, and food stocks. When the Germans came on April 19, 1943, expecting to round up the Jews with no resistance, they were met with gunfire, grenades, and mines. The Germans thought it would take just a few days. It took 27, because the entire community had transformed the ghetto into a network of underground resistance. To tell this story, I've invited onto the show today Professor Samuel Kassow of Trinity College. We'll discuss the courage of the fighters, but also the resistance of those who built the bunkers, who preserved cultural life, who maintained their dignity in ways that have been largely forgotten. And we'll confront difficult questions about heroism, survival, and how to fulfill the sacred obligations of remembering. If you enjoy this conversation, you can discover more big ideas and in-depth analysis on Judaism, Israel, America, and the West at tikvahideas.org. Subscribe to access our full library of podcasts, videos, and essays, and join a growing community focused on Jewish life and the glories of Western civilization. You can subscribe to the Tikvah Podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. I hope you leave us a 5-star review to help us grow this community of ideas. I welcome your feedback on this or any of our other podcast episodes at podcast@tikvah.org. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and bringing these conversations to a wider audience, we welcome potential sponsors. Please email us at podcast.org. And of course, if you want to learn more about our work at Tikvah, you can visit our website, tikvah.org, and follow us on Facebook and X. Here now is my conversation with Sam Kassow. Professor Kassow, welcome to the Tikvah Podcast.
Glad to be here.
So our subject today is really to discuss the Warsaw Ghetto and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and its legacy. But I think that maybe the place to start is with the Jewish community of Warsaw before the war, before the ghetto. I think if you're listening to this conversation and you're 20 years old and you don't know any of this, it's impossible to understand just what kind of Jewish community was there. Why don't we begin with that?
Okay, well, it was almost 400,000 people. It was the biggest Jewish community in Europe. If you have a stereotype of the Jews of Poland as people with beards and kaftans and being all religious, well, that stereotype was not true. The Jews of Warsaw came in all shapes and sizes. There was a very religious segment. There was a big working class. There were many Jews who didn't speak Yiddish at all, but who spoke Polish. Jews were involved in sports. Jews were involved in all different kinds of activities. They were forced to defend themselves against growing Polish anti-Semitism. They were hanging on to against all these laws that made it harder and harder for them to make a living, but they were very proud to be Jewish. It was a strongly Jewish community. It was a community suffused with Jewish pride. There were many daily Yiddish newspapers. There were newspapers for Jews in the Polish language. There were Jewish theaters. There were Jewish soccer clubs. So the Jews of Warsaw were they were strong, they were a creative community. And they also were very politically active. The election campaigns got a lot of evoked a lot of interest. Jews were very active, not just in the Jewish life of Warsaw, but also in the musical life of Warsaw, in the Warsaw Theater. So the Warsaw Jewish community was about 40% of the overall city population.
Okay, and then tell us what happened when the war began and how this ghetto came to be.
Well, the war began on September 1st, 1939. And the Polish army collapsed much faster than people thought. So within a week, the Germans were on the outskirts of Warsaw. And then the Germans surrounded the city. There was a siege that lasted until the end of the month. There was heavy bombing. There was heavy artillery shelling. About 50,000 civilians were killed. The city was devastated. Warsaw finally surrendered at the end of September. And then the Jewish community faced real problems because you had tens of thousands of Jewish refugees who'd come into Warsaw from other cities. Many of the leaders of the Jewish community had run to the east into that part of Poland, which was now occupied by the Soviet army. The Germans lost no time in making life miserable for the Jews. They forced them to wear armbands showing that they were Jewish. They blocked their bank accounts. They didn't allow them to travel on the trains. They drafted them for forced labor. They set up a Judenrat, or a Jewish council, which was a transmission belt for German orders, and they made the Jewish Council responsible for seeing to it that the Jews followed German orders. One of the worst things at first was the forced labor. Jews kidnapped off the streets and sent to labor camps. And then a year after the Germans took over Warsaw, they established a ghetto. The ghetto was established in November 1940. Now, when the Jews entered the Warsaw Ghetto, they had no idea that the ghetto would be closed off. They thought, okay, we're going to be in a ghetto. It's going to be bad, but at least we'll be able to leave during the day before curfew. We'll be able to sell things and make a living. But they were totally surprised the first day to find that the ghetto would be totally closed. And the question of survival then became very, very important. How are we going to survive in this ghetto? Now, when the Germans established this ghetto, there were 400,000 Jews locked up in an area of about 2 square miles. And then over the course of the next year and a half, they dumped 150,000 refugees into the ghetto. During that time, about 100,000 Jews died of starvation or sickness. There was a typhus pandemic. And you could look at this in two ways. One, that 100,000 Jews died. That's a terrible thing. On the other hand, you could ask yourself, that means that while 20% of the Jews died, 80% of the Jews were still alive when, in July 1942, the Germans began to send Jews to the gas chambers of Treblinka. So the question you want to ask is, how did so many Jews survive, especially when the official food ration was 184 calories a day? Keep in mind also that the Germans did not allocate coal to heat the ghetto, which meant that in a building of, say, 2,000 to 3,000 people, there was no heating in the winter, which meant the pipes didn't work, the toilets didn't work, which meant that people couldn't wash, which meant that waste accumulated everywhere, which, of course, made it easier for typhus to spread. So how did Jews fight back? How did they stay alive? They established soup kitchens. They smuggled. Smuggling provided about 85 to 90% of the calories consumed in the Warsaw Ghetto. Smuggling was a major form of resistance. Without smuggling, many more Jews would have died. Now, the smuggling would not have worked without the cooperation of the Poles. So you might say that smuggling was kind of a binational enterprise. Now, what kind of people made good smugglers? It wasn't doctors and lawyers and intellectuals. These were guys who, before the war, had been professional burglars, professional gangsters. But you might say that the underworld helped the ghetto stay afloat. Jews showed incredible resourcefulness. They established underground factories where they took old clothes, old shoes, scrap metal. They turned it into finished products and sold it on the Aryan side. So the ghetto fought back. All of this was a form of resistance. The Jews showed incredible resilience, but in late 1941, the Germans decided that they were going to murder all the Jews in Europe. The first death camp was established near Lodz in Chełmno, and then in the first half of 42, the Germans started to build death camps in central Poland, And beginning on July 22nd, 1942, the Germans started to deport Jews to Treblinka, which was about 50 miles east of Warsaw. What made these deportations even more terrible than they would have been was that most of the dirty work was carried out by Jewish police. That is, especially in the early weeks of the deportation, it was Jewish police that hunted down Jews and handed them over to the Germans. The Jewish police were told that if you catch 5 Jews a day, 7 Jews a day, we'll mark you off as having met your quota, and you will be able to save yourselves and your family. So in addition to the fear of death, there was this terrible humiliation to see Jews being handed over by fellow Jews. And people were paralyzed. They were terrified. There was a meeting of Jewish leaders the first day of the deportation. The head of the Orthodox Party said, we have to trust in God. Leaders of youth movements said, let's fight. But then they went around the room and they asked, how many weapons do we have? They had 2 pistols. And the consensus was, let's not do anything. Let's wait and see, because the Germans deliberately spread rumors when the deportation started that we're only going to take weak people, sick people, people who can't work. We're only going to take 70,000. So if they're only going to take 70,000, why endanger the whole ghetto? And the Germans also had a very clever scheme to paralyze the Jews psychologically. What they did was to say, everybody is going to be deported except category A, B, C, D, E. So if you are gainfully employed, you won't be deported. If you are working in a German shop, you won't be deported. If you have this ID card, you won't be deported. So what they deliberately set out to do was to make Jews think, well, my neighbor is in trouble, but I'm okay, but I'm safe. And every week they tighten the screws. So you thought you were safe working in a shop, and then they come in and they take everybody. You spend your last savings to get a precious ID card. You buy it with the last jewels or dollars that you have, and then 2 weeks later, there's an announcement that this stamp is no longer valid. You have to get another stamp. To make a long story short, between July 22nd and September 12th, they deported up to 300,000 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto. And then they called a pause. That pause began on September 12th. There were 60,000 Jews left. 30,000 had German work permits.
Wait, pause for 1 second. I just want to underscore that. So from the moment that the 400,000 Jews that were living in Poland, in Warsaw, were put into the ghetto, and then the 150 that were brought from elsewhere in Poland were added on top of that. At its maximum, 550,000 Jews were living in the Warsaw Ghetto.
Except that Jews were constantly running away to the Soviet zone, and Jews were dying of starvation or of typhus. So when the deportation started, nobody knows the exact figure, but there are probably around 400,000 Jews in the ghetto. And
so from that 400,000, by the time we're in the fall of 43?
In the fall of 42.
The fall of 42. We're down to how many?
Well, from the 400,000, we're down to 60,000. As of September, by mid-September, we're down to 60,000. Mm-hmm. Half of those 60,000 were the so-called legals, that is, that they had German work permits. Half of the 60,000 were the so-called wild Jews. These were Jews who had no papers, who had hidden out, who had managed to evade the deportations, but they had no legal right to be in the Warsaw Ghetto. But when the pause began on September 12th, and then Jews had a chance to kind of ask themselves, what the hell happened? Why didn't we fight back? Why did we let them take our wives and children? Why were we so paralyzed? When the next time they come to get us, we're not going to go so easily. So there was kind of a psychological sobering up once the deportations halted temporarily, because nobody had any illusions that the Germans weren't going to come back. Now, the German factory owners who employed the Jews said, well, you guys are safe, you're okay, don't worry about it. But there was this feeling of anger, of that Jews were angry at themselves. Why were we like deer in headlights? Why didn't we do something? And of course, the anger was exacerbated by the fact that that the Jews had humiliated themselves because the Jewish police had played such a terrible role. And the Polish people across the wall were saying, you Jews really are pathetic. We Poles, we might have our faults, but we never would have handed over our own people to the Germans. You Jews deserve what you're getting. And so there was this incredible degree of psychological self-flagellation. And that was an important element in the eventual uprising. When historians write about the uprising, they emphasize the role of the fighters. But that's just a tiny bit of the story, because what made the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising so unique, and I'm not the only one who says this, there's an Israeli historian in Tel Aviv, Avi Dreyfus, who's written about this. If you look at other ghettos, the Vilna ghetto, the fighters there had much better weapons, but the ghetto was against them. The ghetto rejected the idea of an armed uprising. In the Bialystok ghetto, the ghetto population rejected the idea of an armed uprising. The fighters were called the Pishers mit de Bixen, the little Pishers with the guns. These young people who were calling on the Jews to fight for Jewish honor, they were feared by the other Jews. These kids are going to bring a disaster on all of us. Now, what was the difference? In Vilna and in Bialystok, Jews still had hope. There were Jewish leaders in the Vilna ghetto, Jacob Gens, Ephraim Barish in the Bialystok ghetto, who were running a pretty good ship. That is, people weren't starving. People were working. These Jewish leaders were saying the Germans need our work. As long as we work, we'll be able to survive. And so as long as you have hope, you're not going to want to commit suicide. Imagine being in a ghetto, and on the one hand, you're 19 years old, you're in a Zionist youth group or a Bundist youth group, and you say, the Germans are going to kill us anyway, so let's fight and die with honor. But across the room is Mottel the tailor, and he's working in a Wehrmacht shop making uniforms for the German army. And they've just gotten 6 months' worth of new orders, and he has a wife and 2 kids. Now, is Mottel the tailor going to want to engage in an uprising, or is he going to hope that in 6 months a miracle is going to happen? So basically, as long as Jews had hope, they were not going to support the idea of an armed uprising. What made Warsaw different was that the so-called Jewish civilian population supported the idea of fighting back. And as
and your argument is that
Dreyfus,
your argument is that part of that support is fueled by a sense of shame at their, if not complicity, then their lack of will during the previous season, when so many of their neighbors and family members were liquidated.
In part of it's fueled by shame. Part of it is fueled by anger at the Jewish police. That the Jewish police have brought dishonor on the Jewish people. Part of this, and this is very, very important, is fueled by the fact that whereas in Vilna or in Bialystok you had Judenrat leaders who were basically respected by the ghetto population and who were doing their best to keep the ghetto going, in Warsaw, the head of the Judenrat, Adam Chernyakov, committed suicide at the beginning of the deportations. He could not cooperate, and he killed himself. And after that, the Judenrat basically disappeared as a factor. So you had a power vacuum. That power vacuum would be eventually filled by the fighting organizations. But you didn't have a Judenrat giving the Jews hope the way they had in Bialystok or in Vilna. Also, you have to understand what was happening in the war. In January 1943, the Germans were about to suffer a huge defeat at Stalingrad. The Allies had already landed in North Africa. People began to have hope. So what happened? They built, and this is really important, you can't understand the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising without this. They built 750 bunkers. Some of these bunkers were equipped with electricity. They were linked to the water supply. They had food supplies for 3 months. It was these bunkers that made the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising what it was. It wasn't just the fighters. It was the fact that they had time to turn the whole ghetto into a network of underground tunnels where they could go from one building to another, from one bunker to another. Had you not had the civilians, the non-fighters building the bunkers, the fighters couldn't have fought more than two days. As it was, it took the Germans 30 days to finally crush the whole uprising. So you had what you might call massive civilian support. Now, there's something else that's an important factor in the ghetto uprising, which is what happened in January. Now, as we know, the ghetto uprising began on Passover in April 1943. But before then, there was January 43. In January, the Germans came into the ghetto to nab about 5,000 to 8,000 Jews, because Himmler was getting very angry at the SS guy in Warsaw, saying, I hear there are a lot of Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto who don't have work papers, and I demand that you go in and you comb the ghetto and you arrest 5,000 to 8,000 people. By this time, the fighting organization had already started to get organized. But the Germans came totally by surprise. People were taken by surprise. And they started marching Jews to the Umschlagplatz to be taken to Treblinka. Mordechai Anilevich, who was remembered as the commander of the fighting organization, although it's a more complicated story than that, Mordechai Anilevich and 4 other fighters from Hashomer Hatzair, including an amazing young woman named Emilka Landau. So there were 5 of them all together. They walked with a group of Jews being marched to the Umschlagplatz, where they would be loaded onto trains. When Anilevich gave a signal, the 5 kids ran out of the column of Jews and started firing at the German guards. 4 of the 5 were immediately shot down. Anilevich ran into a bunker, which turned out to be a bunker on Mila 18, which was built by Jewish gangsters. The Jews who were being led to the Umschlagplatz ran, and in another part of the ghetto, when Germans went into an apartment building, they were met by shots. To make a long story short, the Germans left the ghetto after 2 days, only having taken 4,000 people. The Jews didn't know that Himmler ordered the SS to take a limited number of Jews. The Jews thought that the Germans were coming in to liquidate the whole ghetto. When they saw the Germans leave the ghetto after 2 days, they erroneously thought this was because Jews fought back. And therefore the prestige of the fighters went sky high. And you add to this Stalingrad and German defeats. So between January and April 1943, most of the ghetto is on the side of the fighters, and they're prepared psychologically for a showdown with the Germans. And people who don't have guns are busily building bunkers. And it's those bunkers that are going to make the difference between a 1-day shootout and a 30-day insurrection.
Right. So from my understanding, the Germans estimated that this insurrection would last 3 days or so. And in fact, as you say, it lasted nearly 30 days. So how did the Jews do it?
The Germans didn't think there'd be an insurrection at all. They heard rumors. They thought there might be resistance, but they thought that it wouldn't last more than a day. So they were taken totally by surprise. And in fact, von Sommern, the SS commander, now we're talking about April, right? In April, the Germans marched in to liquidate the ghetto. Now, what the German plan was in April 1943 was that the Jews working in the German factories would not be sent to Treblinka. They would be sent to Majdanek, where they would work in SS factories. In other words, the agenda was not to kill the Jews working in the factories. Jews who didn't have documents would be killed. The German bosses asked their workers to voluntarily go to the trains and go to work in Lublin. Now, what's amazing is that very few workers believed German promises. So when the Germans marched in on the morning of April 19th, 1943, they were met by a hail of fire at different strategic points in the ghetto. Now, it's important that everybody remember that there was not one Jewish fighting organization in the Warsaw Ghetto, there were 2. One fighting organization was the ZOB, the Jewish Fighting Organization, which included Zionist youth movements, the Bund, and communists. The other one was the ZZW, made up of revisionists. While a few members of the ZOB survived and went to Israel, like Yitzhak Zuckerman and Sivia Lubetkin and Simcha Rotem, they helped shape the story of the Ghetto Uprising. And in those years, of course, Israel was dominated by labor governments. So the role of the ZZW, the revisionists, was kind of swept under the table. Also because no members of the ZZW command survived. When Menachem Begin became prime minister in 1977, he and Moshe Aarons and Ariel Sharon and others tried to uncover the role of the ZZW, but it was difficult because nobody survived. But back to April 19th, the fighters occupied key intersections. And when the Germans marched in, they were met with fire from shots from the buildings, but also hand grenades, Molotov cocktails, and mines. They set off mines which exploded. The ZZW fighters, the revisionists, were the best armed, much better armed than the ZOB. They had a machine gun. They had rifles. They also hung a Jewish and a Polish flag on top of the roof, which the Poles could see from across the wall. And so there was very heavy fighting the 19th, the 20th, the 21st. After one day, the Germans fired the SS commander, von Sommern. They thought he was an ineffectual dish rag, and they appointed a new commander called Jürgen Stroop. Jürgen Stroop decided that the way to go was to simply burn every building in the ghetto. And that's what did the fighters in, because by burning building after building after building, the bunkers, of course, became death traps. Now, it didn't occur to the Jews that the Germans would burn the ghetto. They thought that the Germans would not want to burn so many buildings and sacrifice so much property. But once Stroop adopted this tactic of systematic burning of the whole ghetto, the fate of the Jews was sealed. But that said, they kept hiding, they kept fighting. They would dart out at night and shoot at Germans. And while most of the fighting was finished after 3 or 4 days, it took many weeks for the entire ghetto to be cleared. Mila 18, I think, was only cleared on May 8th, and it was on May 15th, almost a month later, that Stroop had German sappers put explosives in the Tlomatsky synagogue, and he wanted to blow it up in one go to serve as the symbolic coda to this successful campaign to destroy the Jews of Warsaw once and for all.
So you've painted us a picture of the active defense undertaken by ZOB and ZZW, the two fighting groups.
Yeah.
But I want to ask about the other people that were still in the ghetto who were hiding in the bunkers. And let me just ask you to sort of paint us a picture. What resistance would have looked like for the 60-year-old woman? What resistance would have looked like for the 12-year-old boy? How did the rest of the community come in to aid this effort?
They aided the effort by letting the fighters come into the bunkers and hide. That was the only thing they could do. But of course, in a very short time, they were literally being burned alive. The Germans took pictures of Jews jumping from 4-story buildings, 5-story buildings. Sometimes Jews would toss mattresses down to the sidewalk, and then they would jump, hoping that they would be able to break the fall. The Germans also used gas, and they were able to roust out thousands of Jews. They shot about 10,000 Jews in the ghetto. They murdered 10,000 Jews in the ghetto. They sent many thousands to Treblinka, and they sent many thousands to Majdanek. In Majdanek, there was another selection, and some Jews were sent to the gas chambers there, some were sent to the factories. But the Jews who were in the Majdanek, in the Lublin factories, they were all murdered on November 3rd, 1943.
Okay, so just explain how it ended. The synagogue that you're just talking about was burned. Basically, the Germans came and burned buildings block by block in order to smoke out and
block by
recapture the
block,
ghetto.
The entire ghetto. And these bunkers were usually deep underground. And so when the building starts to burn, there's no oxygen. The temperature rises, you're being cooked alive. Sometimes the building falls on top of you and you're basically buried alive. Even today, I mean, I worked for 6 years on the Jewish Museum in Warsaw, and that's on the site of the former ghetto. And there are probably many Jewish bodies deep underground. Thousands and thousands of people were buried alive, and their remains are still there.
So, Sam, from the events themselves, as you've just been describing them for us, I now want to turn to the moral and the civilizational meaning of this uprising. You've spent in your own work on the subject a huge amount of time delineating a concept of cultural resistance, the idea that the Jews resisted not only with guns, but also with pen and paper. I want to ask you about that.
Yes. Well, one of the most successful examples of cultural resistance in all of World War II, never mind Jewish resistance, was the Ringelblum underground archive of the Warsaw Ghetto. The historian Emanuel Ringelblum brought together 60 people, of whom only 3 survived. He did not survive. And basically, what Ringelblum said was, the Germans not only want to murder us, but then they're going to decide how we're going to be remembered, if at all. And Ringelblum's teacher, Isaac Schipper, said what we know about murdered peoples is usually what their killers choose to say about them. So, and the Germans thought they'd win the war, and school kids in the future would read in their textbooks that there was this terrible, disgusting race of people called the Jews, and this great man Adolf Hitler did the world a great favor by destroying them. And what Ringelblum said is that even if we don't live to see it, even if we're all killed, we're going to leave time capsules buried under the ghetto. And someday those time capsules will surface, and we will not be remembered as faceless victims, will not be remembered as this anonymous mass of people who were killed. People will remember our names. They'll remember who we were, what we did. They'll remember the Jews based on Jewish documents and not on German documents. So this is an example of cultural resistance. Because of the Ringelblum archive, we have 10 books and counting on what the Jews did in the Warsaw Ghetto, the cultural life, the political life. Religious Jews read the writings of the Piaseczner Rebbe, Kalonymus Shapiro. His writings were buried in the Ringelblum archive. Had the archive never been found, none of this would have been accessible. There would have been no Piaseczner Rebbe, there would have been no Ringelblum diary, no Rabbi Shimon Huberbaum, no Avram Levin. We wouldn't have had the 3,600 pages of the Jewish Underground Press. So that's an incredible example of cultural resistance. But there are other ways to resist, to keep your human dignity. Now remember, most Jews in Warsaw didn't have a chance in hell of going across the wall and pretending to be Polish. So how did they resist? By trying to keep their family together, by helping their neighbors, by serving on their house committees. And there were 1,200 house committees in the Warsaw Ghetto. By participating in the so-called Alleinhilfe, or the self-help. Jews tried to help each other. There was one member of the Ringelblum archive who said, yeah, there was some corruption, there was some demoralization, but the real story of the ghetto are the thousands and thousands of Jews who simply did what they could to keep themselves together and maintain their human dignity. And when we think about the story of the Warsaw Ghetto, while we should honor the young people who fought, and we should also honor the fact that it was their fight that in part inspired the Jews to fight for a Jewish state. While we should never forget that, we should also remember the many, many more Jews who didn't have a chance to fight, but who resisted in other ways. We should also remember something else, that it's much easier to fight when you don't have parents and when you don't have kids. When you have a family, you're not going to easily say goodbye to your parents or turn your back on your kids in order to join a fighting group, which is why most of the fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising were young people who'd already lost their parents, who were not yet married, who didn't have kids of their own. In my mother's ghetto, there was a man, I think he was a physician. His father was an elderly rabbi, and he could have left the ghetto to join the partisans, but he said, no, I'm not going to abandon my father. And he and his father went to the killing pits, and by walking with his father, he spared his father beatings, and he made his father's last moments just a little bit better, if you could use the word. Now, would we say that someone like that was a coward or went to his death like a sheep to the slaughter? He could have joined the partisans, but should we say that he was any less heroic because he chose not to abandon an elderly parent? So while we should hallow the memory of the Warsaw Ghetto fighters, we should never let it really blind us to the heroism of the many other Jews who didn't have the chance to engage in armed resistance.
Right, and you can understand what a potent symbol the uprising would become afterwards for the very Zionist revisionists whose contribution had been muted by labor at that time. You can understand what a potent symbol that the uprising would become in the Zionist ethos because of what it seemed to symbolize about the Jewish embrace of power and responsibility.
Yes, that is true, but certainly the way that Israel remembers the Shoah today is a little different from how they remembered the Shoah in the 1950s, especially after Israelis went through the terrible fear of those weeks before the Six-Day War, when they went through the terrible ordeal of those first couple days of the Yom Kippur War. Many Sabras, who up to then had been very condescending towards Holocaust survivors. Why didn't you fight? Why didn't you do what these kids in the Warsaw Ghetto did? Many Sabras began to understand that the story was much more complicated. So I think Israel today looks at the Shoah after the Eichmann trial too with a little more empathy. What I don't like to see is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the memory of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, misused in such a way as to make an invidious comparison between the allegedly heroic fighters, they were heroic, but the passive masses. I think that does a great disservice to the entire Jewish people. And it dishonors the memory of the victims. And keep in mind that people who weren't there simply have no idea what it was like.
Well, even so, you yourself have said that Emanuel Ringelblum understood that he was preserving this portrait of Jewish life defined by the Jews themselves for future historians. Yeah. In other words, for you. So some 8 decades later, with the last fighters now gone, what is our obligation to remember? What does the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising now teach us about courage, about Jewish power, about dignity? What lessons should we draw from it?
Well, the basic lesson is that we have to fight for our survival. We should never forget. We should never take our survival for granted. At the same time, we should remember our history in such a way that we don't denigrate the memory of those who resisted in other ways. So, in other words, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was important. You look at the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, you look at the battle waged by Jewish partisans, you look at the whole record of Jewish cultural resistance in the Holocaust, and you really understand this will to live. You understand this national pride. You understand the kind of an energy which was a factor in the establishment of the State of Israel, especially after October 7th, when there's this great upsurge of anti-Semitism, and there are these charges being leveled at the Jewish people. It's very important to look back at this Jewish battle for national survival and not to take national survival for granted. But on the other hand, I'm a historian, and the job of a historian is to complicate things. The job of the historian is to say, yes, but. If I were writing advertising slogans, or sound bites, my job would be different. So I have to look at the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and all the nuance and in all the context, remembering that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was the exception, it was not the rule. And if you look at the history of the Holocaust, when did Jews rise up? In the Warsaw Ghetto, in the Auschwitz Sonderkommando, in Treblinka, in Sobibor. They rise up when there's no hope. They rise up when there's no hope of survival, their backs are against the wall, and they're basically choosing how they're going to die.
Okay, well, if there's one final image, one story, one person from the uprising that you want listeners to this conversation to carry with them, something that captures the yes, but, the complexity that you've just reminded us is our mission in our own collective memory, what would that be?
From the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, I would say Simcha Rotem, who was a ghetto fighter who died in Israel a couple years ago. He went back into the sewers and he rescued some fighters in the sewers. He fought in the Polish uprising of 1944. He then went to Israel. But I'll never forget what he said in Warsaw, and I think 2013, at the 70th anniversary of the uprising. He said, don't just think of us fighters, think of the other Jews in the ghetto who didn't have the weapons. And we always asked ourselves, he said, we fighters always asked ourselves, did we really have the right to do what we did? Did we really have the right to make a decision for all those other people? And it's a question that he never stopped asking himself.
This conversation was recorded on October 28th, 2025. Professor Kassow, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.